My name is Bonnie Edwards. I am 32 years old, and last Tuesday, the head pastor of my parents' megachurch called my direct office line to tell me my family had committed a federal crime. To understand the weight of that sentence, you have to understand what my parents did 6 months earlier. They stood on a stage, bathed in theatrical lighting, and donated my entire inheritance to a youth ministry building fund. They did it to punish me. They did it to prove that my independence was a sin and their control was divine. They spent half a year bragging about their holy sacrifice to anyone who would listen. But Pastor David was not calling to offer prayers. He was calling because his accountant found the paper trail. I should tell you how my brain works. I'm a commercial actuary. I work on the 22nd floor of a steel and glass high-rise in downtown Denver. My profession revolves around calculating the exact mathematical probability of a collapse. I evaluate risk profiles. I read ledgers the way other people read novels. I know that structures do not fail without warning. They fail because the foundation was rotten long before the roof caved in. Welcome to Pana Vengeance. This channel is for the quiet ones who finally decide to stop keeping the peace and start keeping the receipts. How old were you when you realized your parents were capable of true betrayal? Drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. The day Pastor David called was an ordinary Tuesday, 10:14 in the morning. The HVAC unit hummed a low, steady rhythm above my desk. The traffic down on Colfax Avenue crawled in a muted gray line. I was holding a chipped green ceramic coffee mug. I bought that mug at a Goodwill during my sophomore year at Colorado University. It cost me 50 cents. I keep it on my immaculate glass desk as a physical anchor. It reminds me of the years I worked graveyard shifts at a data center, wearing a thrifted wool coat that let the winter wind straight through to my ribs. It reminds me of the nights I studied probability models under flickering fluorescent lights, while my parents quietly paid off the business debts of my older brother, Jason. Jason is 34. He is the golden son. He has never held a job for more than 11 months. His ventures always sound noble. A faith-based coffee roaster that went bankrupt in 6 months. A community consulting firm with 0 actual clients. Yet, he drives a late-model SUV and lives in a loft with exposed brick. My parents call him a visionary facing spiritual warfare. They call my self-reliance a rebellious spirit. When the caller ID on my desk phone flashed Grace Fellowship, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I had not spoken to my mother or father in 3 years. I had not set foot in their sprawling campus in Colorado Springs since the day I packed my Honda Civic and drove north. But my actuarial training dictates that you never ignore an anomaly. Grace Fellowship calling my unlisted office number was an anomaly. I picked up the receiver. Bonnie Edwards. The breathing on the other end was shallow and rapid. It sounded like a man who had just climbed a steep flight of stairs. Bonnie. It was Pastor David. He skipped the rehearsed warmth he usually projected from the pulpit. He did not ask how my week was going. He did not offer a scripture verse. He delivered a single, sharp sentence. We cannot legally keep the money. Most people would ask, what money? I did not ask. I knew the exact sum. $350,000. The estate my grandfather William left behind. I set the chipped mug down on a cork coaster. The ceramic made a dull thud. I moved my mouse, minimized my emails, and opened a blank Excel spreadsheet. Go on, I said. Pastor David swallowed hard. The sound amplified through the receiver. Our independent CPA is conducting the quarterly reconciliation for the new Youth Wing project, the one your parents sponsored. I kept my voice neutral, a measured tone. The one they sponsored with my grandfather's estate, yes. The CPA flagged the wire transfer. David said, his voice dropped, forcing me to press the phone closer to my ear. The bank initiated an automatic freeze on the funds under their anti-money laundering protocols. My fingers rested on the home row of the keyboard. Why would a church donation trigger a federal fraud freeze, David? because of the tax identification number attached to the routing sequence. It did not match your parents' joint accounts. It did not match their business accounts. Whose tax ID was it? There was a long stretch of static. Then he answered, William Edwards. I looked away from the monitor. I stared at the jagged silhouette of the Rocky Mountains framing the Denver skyline. The sky was a hard, unblinking blue. My grandfather William had been in the ground for 10 months. Dead men do not authorize six-figure wire transfers. My parents had not just weaponized my inheritance to teach me a lesson. They had bypassed the probate court, forged a financial authorization, and funneled stolen assets into a tax-exempt religious organization. The grand, pious donation they had been parading around Colorado Springs was a crime. Bonnie, David whispered. The strain in his throat was palpable. The CPA is threatening to contact the IRS by Friday if we cannot produce the original probate clearance. Your parents are not returning my calls. I need to see you privately. Today. I typed the number 350,000 into cell A1. I hit enter. Name the place, I said. I hung up the phone. The quiet of my office rushed back in. The HVAC hummed. The city moved below. I did not feel fear. I felt the cold, familiar click of a puzzle piece locking into place. My parents had built their entire identity on a foundation of moral superiority. But math does not care about morality. Math only cares about the ledger. I opened a new tab on my browser and typed in the web address for the El Paso County Probate Court. I needed to see exactly what lie my mother had filed to get her hands on that account. The true cost of my independence was about to be calculated. The El Paso County Probate Portal is a relic of early internet design. It operates with a sluggish gray interface that tests the patience of anyone trying to uncover public records. As the blue loading bar crawled across my monitor, my mind dragged me backward to a Sunday evening 6 months ago. That was the night the theft was formalized. My parents had summoned me to their home in Colorado Springs. The invitation arrived via a brief text message from my mother, stating we needed to discuss the final arrangements regarding my grandfather's passing. I drove an hour south on Interstate 25, expecting a somber conversation about headstones or outstanding medical bills. I should have known better. My family does not do somber. They do theater. I walked into the formal dining room. The table was set with the good silver and the stiff linen napkins my mother reserved for the holidays. She sat at the foot of the table, wearing a pressed ivory blouse and a single strand of cultured pearls. My father sat at the head, radiating the quiet, rigid authority he cultivated to keep his household in line. Sitting across from my empty chair was Jason. He wore a golf polo and leaned back, checking his phone with a loose, relaxed posture. He did not look like a man grieving his grandfather. He looked like a man waiting for a punchline. My mother brought out a roast beef. The porcelain serving dish clattered softly against the mahogany table. She did not offer a prayer for the dead. She folded her hands, rested them on the edge of the table, and looked directly at me. Bonnie, she began, her voice coated in a sugary cadence that always signaled a trap. Your father and I have spent the last month in deep spiritual reflection regarding the estate your grandfather left behind. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I waited. You chose to walk away from our community. My father intervened. His tone lacked the artificial sweetness of my mother's. It was pure granite. You rejected the church. You rejected the values we instilled in you. You moved to the city to pursue a worldly path. We cannot in good conscience fund that rebellion. My mother picked up the thread seamlessly. They had rehearsed this. We realized that giving you access to $350,000 would only further isolate you from the flock. It would enable your spiritual wandering. So we have made a decision as the executors of the estate. She paused, expecting me to interrupt, expecting me to beg or demand or crack. I set my water glass down. I kept my eyes locked on the bridge of her nose. We are donating the entirety of your grandfather's remaining assets to the Grace Fellowship Youth Wing Building Fund. My mother smiled, a thin, tight expression devoid of warmth. We are doing this to correct your path, Bonnie. We hope that seeing this money serve a higher purpose will humble your heart and bring you back home." Across the table, Jason let out a soft breath. He nodded smugly, picking up his fork. He was 34 years old, living in a subsidized loft, and he was grinning because his little sister was being financially executed right in front of him. They weaponized the only man in our family who had ever shown me unconditional kindness. My grandfather William taught me how to play chess. He taught me how to calculate compound interest on a legal pad. He never cared that I did not want to sing in the choir. He only cared that my mind was sharp. Now his legacy was being used as a bludgeon to break my independence. They wanted to force me into a position where I would have to rely on them again. I looked at the roast beef on my plate. I picked up my silver knife and fork. The dining room was dead silent. The only sound was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I pressed the edge of the knife into the meat. The metal scraped against the porcelain. It was a sharp, defining sound. I cut a small piece. I placed it in my mouth. I chewed slowly, analyzing the texture. It was overcooked. I swallowed the food. I picked up the linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate. Then I stood up. I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of witnessing my pain. I pushed my chair in and walked out the front door, leaving them trapped in the deafening silence of their own malice. The blue loading bar on my office monitor finally reached the end of the screen. The digital portal chimed, snapping me back to the present. I stared at the search fields. My chest felt tight, but my actuarial training took over, overriding the lingering sting of that memory. The timeline of their scheme contained a glaring structural flaw. If my parents donated the estate 6 months ago, why was the transaction triggering an anti-money laundering freeze today? Wire transfers from a standard liquidated estate clear within 3 to 5 business days. Grace Fellowship had already broken ground on the youth wing. They had printed the brochures, thanking my family. The money should have been absorbed into the church accounts months ago. A sudden IRS and banking audit half a year later meant something had laid dormant. The routing number had not just bounced, it had triggered a retroactive flag. That happens when a financial institution runs a routine sweep of high-yield transfers against the National Social Security Death Index. I typed William Edwards into the county probate search bar. I narrowed the date parameters to the month following his death. I clicked Search. 3 documents populated on the screen. The first was a standard death certificate filing. The second was a notice to creditors. The third document made my pulse stop. It was categorized as a small estate affidavit. In the state of Colorado, a small estate affidavit is a legal shortcut. It allows an heir to bypass formal probate court entirely. It is designed for simple, modest estates, usually capped at under $80,000. It is a 1-page form you can download from the internet, sign in front of a notary, and hand directly to a bank teller to drain an account. $350,000 is not a small estate. It exceeds the statutory limit by miles. The only way my mother could have used this specific form was if she lied about the total value of the assets under penalty of perjury. I clicked the PDF icon. The scanned document filled my monitor. I scrolled down to the second page. Box 3 required the affiant to swear that the deceased left no valid will or trust. My mother had checked the box marked true. She had declared, under oath, that my grandfather died intestate. I scrolled down to the third page, the signature line. There it was, William Arthur Edwards. The ink was black. The cursive was elegant and sweeping. The loops on the capital W and the capital E were perfectly formed. It was a single, unbroken line of steady, confident penmanship. I leaned closer to the glowing screen. The air in my office felt suddenly thin. My grandfather died of complications related to advanced Parkinson's disease. For the last 2 years of his life, he could not hold a ceramic coffee mug without spilling the contents down his shirt. He could not button his own cardigan. I remember sitting beside his armchair, helping him sign a birthday card for my 29th birthday. It took him 4 agonizing minutes to write the word love. The letters were jagged, spidery, and broken. Parkinson's leaves a cruel, distinct map on a piece of paper. It turns the hand into a seismograph, recording every tremor in the nervous system. The signature on the screen had no tremors. It had no map. It was flawlessly smooth. It was drawn by a hand that did not shake. My mother had not just used a legal loophole. She had forged my grandfather's name on a sworn county document. She committed identity theft against her own deceased father to steal the money he meant for me. The screen glowed, reflecting in the glass of my office window. The puzzle piece locked into place. I did not just have a grievance anymore. I had the physical evidence of a felony. My desk phone rang again. The sharp trill cut through the quiet. I let it ring twice before picking up. It was not Pastor David this time. The number on the caller ID belonged to a Denver area code, a number I recognized from long ago. The conflict was escalating. The timeline was compressing. My mother had left a paper trail, and now someone else was reaching out to ensure I never followed it. The caller ID flashing on my desk phone displayed a local Denver sequence. I recognized the digits from a group text sent months ago. I lifted the receiver and held it to my ear without speaking. "Hey, little sister." It was Jason. His voice carried a manufactured casualness, a breezy, artificial tone he only adopted when he was cornered. "I just wanted to check in." He continued, filling the quiet line. "Mom said you might be going through a tough time with work. Wanted to see if you needed anything." He was fishing. The timing was too precise. The bank had flagged the wire transfer. Pastor David was panicking. My brother was calling to determine the exact blast radius of the imminent explosion. He wanted to know if the church had contacted me regarding the frozen funds. "I am working, Jason," I said. "All right, well, do not work too hard." He chuckled, a hollow, nervous sound. "Family is always here for you, Bonnie. Remember that." I set the receiver gently back into its cradle, severing the connection. Hearing his voice brought the profound disparity of our lives into sharp, unrelenting focus. He sat in a spacious loft with exposed brick walls, making phone calls in the middle of a Tuesday, pretending to be a professional. I had earned my seat in this high-rise through a decade of calculated endurance. When I was 20 years old, I worked the graveyard shift at a subterranean data center on the outskirts of the city. My job was to monitor the server racks from midnight until 8 in the morning. The facility was kept at a constant 58 degrees to prevent the machines from overheating. I could not afford a proper winter jacket, so I wore a thrifted gray wool coat. The lining was torn. The wind would bite right through the worn fabric every time I walked to the bus stop. Inside the server room, the noise was a constant, deafening roar of cooling fans. The air smelled of hot dust and ozone. I would sit at a metal folding table under harsh fluorescent bulbs, shivering in my cheap coat, tracing actuarial formulas with a blue ballpoint pen. I studied the mathematics of risk while my peers slept. I paid my tuition in monthly installments, calculated down to the last penny. I ate rice and beans because protein was a luxury variable my budget could not accommodate. During those exact same years, Jason was launching his ventures. His first idea was a faith-based subscription box service. My parents funded the inventory, the warehouse space, and the glossy marketing materials. It folded in 8 months. His second concept was a modesty-focused apparel line. My father took out a second mortgage to cover the manufacturing costs. The clothes sat in a storage unit until they were donated to a landfill. His third attempt was a digital ministry application. He hired developers using my mother's retirement savings. The app never launched. Every time Jason failed, my parents opened their checkbooks and cushioned his fall. They called it investing in his spiritual calling. Meanwhile, they looked at my survival and branded it as arrogance. Psychologists have a term for this specific family dynamic. They call it the self-sufficient scapegoat. Because I did not need them, they resented me. Because I built my own foundation, they felt justified in dismantling my future to heat their favorite son's house. My competence became their permission slip for theft. They convinced themselves that since Bonnie was fine, Bonnie did not require her inheritance. They painted my capability as a vice and his incompetence as a virtue. It is a brilliant twisting of reality that allows thieves to sleep soundly at night, believing they are righteous. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors on my desk. The forged affidavit was still open on the left screen. I needed to understand the other side of the equation. I needed to look at the institution that received the stolen assets. Grace Fellowship is a nonprofit religious organization. Under federal law, tax-exempt entities are required to file a specific annual return, known as a Form 990. These documents are public record. They detail revenue, expenditures, board members, and top compensated employees. I accessed the IRS database and pulled the filings for the last 3 fiscal years. My initial theory centered on the man who had just called me in a panic, Pastor David. I wondered if he was a corrupt architect orchestrating the entire scheme. He sounded terrified on the phone. A guilty man fears a federal audit. Megachurch pastors handle exorbitant amounts of discretionary capital. Did he convince my mother to forge the probate document in exchange for a quiet percentage of the building fund? Was he skimming the youth ministry accounts to line his own pockets? I approached the tax forms the way a surgeon approaches an operating table. I stripped away the narrative and looked only at the raw data. I reviewed his listed salary. It was generous, fitting the profile of a large congregation, but it remained consistent year over year. There were no sudden spikes in his compensation. I checked the board of directors. No irregularities. I cross-referenced the real estate acquisitions. Everything appeared standard for a growing church. The red herring faded. Pastor David was not a criminal mastermind. He was just a coward caught in the crossfire of an audit he could not control. I scrolled down to Schedule O. This section of the form requires the organization to disclose detailed information regarding independent contractors and high-dollar vendor payouts. This is where organizations bury their secrets. They hide questionable expenditures behind vague corporate names and generalized billing descriptions. I scanned the rows of data: landscaping services, audio-visual maintenance, architectural drafting. Then a specific entry caught my eye. It was a new vendor listed in the most recent quarterly addendum, a limited liability company operating under the name Agape Consulting. The church had billed an exorbitant sum to this entity, $85,000, dispersed in a single fiscal quarter for services described merely as community outreach coordination. A church building a new youth wing does not spend $85,000 on an external outreach consultant unless the money is being moved with a specific secondary purpose. I opened a third tab. The Colorado Secretary of State maintains a searchable registry of all active businesses. I typed Agape Consulting into the search field and pressed enter. The system retrieved the articles of organization. The document displayed the date of formation. The LLC was registered precisely 2 weeks after my grandfather passed away. My heart beat a slow, methodical rhythm against my ribs. I scrolled to the bottom of the digital page to view the registered agent details. The state requires every business to list a physical address and a designated individual authorized to receive legal documents. The registered agent was listed as J. Edwards. The physical address was Unit 402 on Larimer Street. I closed my eyes. The image of exposed brick walls and expensive espresso machines flashed behind my eyelids. I knew that address. I had helped my brother move a leather sofa into that exact building 4 years ago. The puzzle assembled itself in my mind, forming a picture of breathtaking betrayal. My parents did not just give my grandfather's money to God out of some twisted sense of spite. They did not hand over $350,000 merely to fund a youth wing and teach their rebellious daughter a lesson. That was the cover story they sold to the congregation. They executed a sophisticated money laundering operation. They bypassed probate by forging a legal document. They transferred the stolen assets into the church accounts, claiming a massive charitable tax deduction for themselves. Then the church funneled a substantial portion of those exact funds right back out to a newly created shell company. a shell company controlled by their golden son. Grace Fellowship was paying Jason a lucrative, untraceable salary, using the exact money my grandfather intended for my future. My brother had called me today not because he cared about my well-being. He called because the anti-money laundering freeze on the initial donation meant his fraudulent paychecks were about to stop. I opened my desk drawer and retrieved my car keys. I had enough digital evidence to ruin their lives. But digital evidence was not going to satisfy the ledger. To spring the trap, I needed to hear the pastor admit it to my face. The drive south on Interstate 25 offered a monotonous stretch of gray pavement and sprawling suburban development. The radio remained off. The silence inside my sedan was absolute, matching the calculated quiet of my thoughts. I was heading to a Panera Bread located in a sterile strip mall halfway between Denver and Colorado Springs. The location was a deliberate choice. It was public enough to prevent a scene and neutral enough to strip away any home court advantage Pastor David might possess. He could not hide behind stained glass or a pulpit here. He would have to face me over laminate tables and the smell of toasted bagels. I arrived 7 minutes early. I ordered a black coffee, paid in exact change, and selected a booth in the far corner facing the entrance. My actuarial training teaches that positioning dictates control. You always observe the variables before they observe you. Pastor David walked through the glass doors precisely at noon. He was out of his element. He wore a rumpled gray suit jacket over a polo shirt, looking less like a spiritual leader and more like a middle manager facing an unannounced corporate audit. He scanned the dining room, his eyes darting past the college students studying at laptops and the mothers corralling toddlers. When he saw me, his shoulders dropped, not with relief, but with the heavy resignation of a man walking toward an executioner. He slid into the booth opposite me. He carried a ceramic mug of hot tea and a thick manila folder. He set the folder down with a soft thud, keeping his hand resting on the cover. "Hello, Bonnie," he said. His voice lacked any commanding timbre. I did not offer a greeting. I took a slow sip of my coffee, maintaining unbroken eye contact. My silence forced him to speak first, to fill the uncomfortable void, to justify his presence. He reached for a wooden stirrer stick and began agitating his tea. The motion was erratic. The liquid sloshed against the rim of his mug. He was a man accustomed to directing the narrative. Sitting across from a woman who refused to provide an emotional reaction was dismantling his composure. "You must be confused." He started trying to adopt a gentle pastoral cadence. "I want you to know that the church leadership had no prior knowledge regarding the origin of your parents' donation. We operate on faith. We assume the gifts we receive are given with a clean heart." I set my coffee down. "Let us skip the sermon, David. You called my office in a panic because a bank froze $350,000. Tell me exactly what the CPA found." He abandoned the gentle tone. He stopped stirring the tea. His hand moved back to the manila folder. He opened the flap and slid a single sheet of paper across the laminate table. It was a printed copy of the wire transfer receipt. The numbers were laid out in stark black and white. The origination date, the routing codes, the receiving institution. My eyes scanned the sequence of digits tracking the path of the stolen assets. The transaction had cleared from a local branch of First National Bank. I looked at the specific account number listed as the source. It ended in 8802. The numbers hit me with the force of a physical blow. The breath hitched slightly in my chest, though I did not let the reaction show on my face. That specific sequence of digits held a profound history. When I was born, my grandfather opened a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act account. A UTMA is a custodial financial vehicle designed to hold assets for a child until they reach the age of majority. For 18 years, my grandfather deposited a portion of his pension into that account every single month. He told me it was my foundation. He told me it was the safety net that would allow me to walk away from any situation that compromised my integrity. The account number ended in 8802. My parents had not merely drained his general checking balance. They had deliberately targeted the specific custodial account he built explicitly for me. They had forged his signature to liquidate the exact mechanism designed to guarantee my independence. The CPA demanded proof of authorization for a transfer originating from a deceased individual's personal trust. The pastor explained, his voice tight. When your parents could not produce the probate clearance, the bank initiated a mandatory federal review. He folded his hands together, leaning across the table. His knuckles were white. Bonnie, the church is currently in the middle of a massive capital campaign. If the Internal Revenue Service launches a full probe into money laundering within our building fund, we lose our tax-exempt status. We lose our lenders. The entire project collapses. The board of directors met last night. We made a decision to reject the donation. We attempted to return the funds to your parents to scrub the transaction from our ledgers. I raised an eyebrow. The logic was flawed. If you returned the money, the crisis would be resolved. Why are we sitting in a Panera Bread? Because they refused to take it back, he whispered, the desperation finally breaking through his facade. I leaned back against the vinyl booth. The sheer audacity of my parents' scheme was coming into sharp focus. They were trapped. If they accepted a reverse wire transfer of $350,000 from the church, it would generate a massive taxable event. It would create an undeniable digital paper trail pointing directly back to their forged small estate affidavit. Accepting the refund meant confessing to a felony. They preferred to leave the church holding the explosive device rather than risk holding it themselves. Your father threatened to sue the church for breach of contract if we reversed the transfer. The pastor continued rubbing his temples. He claims the money was a binding charitable gift. He claims they have already claimed the deduction on their federal taxes. If we bounce the money back, it triggers an audit for everyone involved. He was not a corrupt mastermind. He was a coward who had happily accepted stolen money and was now terrified of the consequences. He had allowed my parents to launder their theft through his sanctuary, and now the sanctuary was burning. He reached into the manila folder one more time. He pulled out a legal document. It was 3 pages long, printed on heavy stock paper. It bore the letterhead of an expensive Denver law firm. He pushed it toward me. We need to resolve this quietly, he pleaded. The church attorneys drafted this. It is a waiver of interest. If you sign this, acknowledging that you relinquish any personal claim to the funds originating from account 8802, the bank will lift the freeze. The church absorbs the capital. We pay a private penalty fee, and the federal inquiry disappears. I looked at the document. It was a release form designed to sever my rights permanently. It was a legal gag order. We will compensate you, of course, he added hurriedly, sliding a pen across the table. The board has authorized a discretionary payout. We can offer you $25,000 for your signature today, a private consulting fee, completely untraceable. He was offering me a fraction of my own stolen inheritance as hush money to protect the very people who robbed me. He wanted me to ratify the theft. He wanted me to become an accomplice in the cover-up of the exact crime committed against my own future. The audacity of the request was breathtaking. I did not touch the pen. I did not touch the waiver. I looked at the man sitting across from me. He was sweating. A bead of perspiration traced a path down his temple. He was a spiritual leader begging for absolution in a strip mall bakery. I picked up the waiver. I folded it neatly in half. Then I folded it again into quarters. I slid the thick square of paper back across the table, stopping an inch from his coffee mug. I utilized my professional voice, the cool, detached tone I reserve for analyzing a catastrophic failure in a structural assessment. I do not sign blind contracts, David. His eyes widened. Bonnie, please, if this goes to court, your parents could face prison. Your brother could be implicated. The church will be ruined. We are talking about destroying your own family. I looked at him with unwavering precision. My family destroyed themselves. I am just the actuary, finalizing the math. I picked up my purse and slid out of the booth. I left him sitting alone with his cold tea and his folded waiver. The air outside the bakery was crisp, The afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across the parking lot. My parents had forged a county document to bypass the courts. They had tricked the bank using a small estate loophole. But the state of Colorado requires a physical, original copy of a last will and testament to be lodged with the county clerk upon a death, regardless of the estate size. If my mother lied about my grandfather dying intestate, the proof was not on a digital portal. The proof was locked in a concrete room. I unlocked my sedan. The digital trail had given me the motive and the method. But to drop the hammer on a federal wire fraud indictment, I needed the physical, undeniable paper. I knew exactly where the county kept their archived files. I started the engine. The confrontation was moving from the digital realm into the physical world. I was going to the courthouse. The drive back to my condo was calculated. I needed to drop my laptop and secure my printed financial spreadsheets before heading to the El Paso County Courthouse. The physical paper trail was my primary objective. But my apartment offered a brief sanctuary to organize my thoughts. The digital breadcrumbs I had gathered so far presented a compelling narrative of wire fraud, but prosecuting a felony required an unbroken chain of custody. I parked in my designated spot in the underground garage. The concrete walls echoed with the heavy mechanical thump of the security gate sliding shut behind me. I took the elevator to the 5th floor. My condo is a study in minimalism, neutral colors, clean lines, and precisely 0 unnecessary objects. I have cultivated an environment devoid of clutter because my childhood home was overflowing with the heavy, suffocating debris of religious iconography and emotional manipulation. Every object in my parents' house carried an expectation or a debt. I preferred empty space. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside. The quiet of my living room was immediately shattered by 3 sharp, precise raps against the heavy wood. The sound did not belong here. No one visits my building unannounced. The concierge requires authorization for all guests. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. My mother was standing in the hallway. She wore a tailored navy blazer and a silk scarf tied meticulously around her neck. In her right hand, she clutched a large glass Tupperware container filled with baked lasagna. In her left hand, she held a thick manila envelope. The sheer logistical calculation required for her to be standing on my mat was staggering. She had driven an hour north from Colorado Springs, bypassed the security desk, likely by slipping in behind a resident, and navigated an unfamiliar building to locate a unit she had never previously visited. This was not a casual drop-in. This was a tactical strike. I took a steady breath, regulating my heart rate to a slow, deliberate rhythm. I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door. "Bonnie, sweetheart." Her voice was pitched an octave higher than normal, radiating a syrupy, artificial warmth. She extended the Tupperware toward me, presenting the heavy dish like a peace offering. "I know you hate unannounced visits, but I was in the city for a church auxiliary meeting. I made your favorite recipe. I thought we could visit for a moment." The lasagna was weaponized maternal care. It was a physical prop designed to force compliance through the social obligation of accepting a gift. To refuse the food would frame me as ungrateful and hostile, allowing her to claim the moral high ground before the conversation even began. I did not reach for the glass container. I blocked the threshold, keeping my stance wide and planted. "Hello, Mom. How did you get past the lobby desk?" She offered a breathy, dismissive laugh. "Oh, the nice young man was busy with a delivery. I just followed a neighbor inside. I did not want to bother him." She shifted the weight of the heavy dish. "May I come in?" The drive was terribly long. I stepped aside, leaving the door open to signal the temporary nature of her intrusion. She walked into my living room, placing the Tupperware on the clean surface of my kitchen island. Her eyes darted around the minimalist space, assessing the lack of photographs, the absence of decorative warmth. She was looking for leverage and finding none. She turned back to me, clasping her hands together over the manila envelope. "It is lovely what you have done with this place, Bonnie. Very modern. Very clean." She offered another tight smile. "I know we left things on a difficult note at Sunday dinner months ago. Your father and I have prayed constantly for a resolution. We want our family to be whole again. I remained near the open door. State your business, Mom. I have a meeting in 20 minutes. The artificial warmth hardened around the edges. She disliked being rushed. She disliked losing control of the pacing. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the paper envelope. Since you are so busy, I will be direct, she said, abandoning the syrupy tone for a crisp, managing cadence. As you know, the Grace Fellowship Youth Wing is nearing completion. The dedication ceremony is scheduled for this Saturday. The building committee is finalizing the donor recognition plaques. They are installing a beautiful bronze fixture in the main atrium, honoring your grandfather's legacy. She opened the envelope and slid out a single sheet of paper. She laid it flat on the kitchen island next to the lasagna. The church administration requires a routine consent form from all direct descendants. She explained, her voice steady and practiced. It is merely a formality for the historical record, acknowledging that the family is united in the charitable application of the estate. Jason has already signed his portion. Your father and I have signed ours. We just need your signature on the bottom line. She pulled a silver pen from her blazer pocket and clicked the top, extending the ink cartridge. She set the pen down next to the document. It will take 2 seconds, she added softly. Then I will leave you in peace to enjoy your dinner. I walked slowly toward the kitchen island. The setup was a masterful stroke of emotional engineering. She had framed a high-stakes legal maneuver as a sentimental administrative chore. She used the promise of a bronze plaque to distract from the actual mechanism of the paper. She was demanding my signature, the exact currency required to ratify a contract. I did not pick up the pen. I looked down at the document. The header did not mention a bronze plaque. The header did not mention a dedication ceremony. The text was dense, packed with legalese and liability clauses. I scanned the first paragraph, reading the specific phrasing drafted to protect the receiving institution. It was an indemnification agreement. The document explicitly stated that the undersigned heir relinquished any and all claims to the assets liquidated from account 8802. It was a retroactive validation of the forged transfer. By signing this paper, I would be legally declaring that I consented to the seizure of my UTMA trust fund, effectively nullifying any future claim of wire fraud or theft. She was trying to trick me into signing away the weapon I needed to destroy her. I looked up from the paper. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had spent 32 years punishing me for my competence, the woman who had forged her own dying father's name to steal my future and was now standing in my kitchen, attempting to manipulate me into legal submission with a pan of baked pasta. The audacity was staggering. The calculation was chilling. I picked up the document. I did not fold it. I held it loosely in my left hand. I cannot sign this, Mom, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of inflection. Her posture shifted instantly. The tight smile vanished, replaced by a rigid, defensive glare. Why not? It is a standard form, Bonnie. Stop being difficult. You are holding up the entire dedication project over petty stubbornness. I held her gaze, refusing to look away. I cannot sign it because I do not recall consenting to the liquidation of a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act custodial account. I do not recall authorizing the withdrawal of $350,000. And I certainly do not recall signing a small estate affidavit filed under penalty of perjury. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a stark ashen white. The mention of the small estate affidavit struck her like a physical impact. She took a half step backward, her hand instinctively reaching out to grip the edge of the quartz countertop for balance. I do not know what you are talking about, she stammered, her voice thin and breathless. You know exactly what I am talking about. I replied, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal register. The bank froze the transfer, Mom. Pastor David called me. He told me everything. He showed me the routing numbers. Her chest heaved. The polished facade of the devout matriarch shattered completely, exposing the terrified, desperate thief underneath. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit, an excuse, a way to regain control of the collapsing narrative. "You ungrateful, arrogant girl," she hissed, the venom finally spilling over. "We raised you. We provided for you. That money belonged to this family. You had no right to hoard it while your brother was struggling. We did what was necessary to protect Jason. The Lord understands our intentions." "The Lord does not audit wire transfers," I stated cleanly. "The Internal Revenue Service does." She lunged forward, snatching the silver pen from the counter. She did not attempt to grab the document from my hand, realizing the futility of a physical struggle. She spun around and marched toward the open front door, her heels striking the hardwood floor with violent, erratic force. "You will regret this, Bonnie," she shouted from the hallway, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You are destroying your own blood over greed. God will judge you for what you are doing to us." I walked to the door. "I am not doing anything to you, Mom. I am just reading the ledger." I shut the heavy wooden door, closing the deadbolt with a decisive metallic snap. The quiet of my condo returned instantly, settling over the space like dust. I walked back to the kitchen island. The heavy glass Tupperware sat next to my laptop bag. I picked up the forged indemnification agreement, the paper she had tried to trick me into signing. It was a tangible piece of evidence linking her directly to the cover-up attempt. I turned the document over, inspecting the back page. A small detail caught my attention, a faint blue ink impression bleeding through the heavy stock from the previous page. It was a notary stamp, indicating where the signature was meant to be authorized. I examined the stamp closely. It was not a municipal seal. It belonged to a junior clerk employed at a retail shipping franchise located in a strip mall off Academy Boulevard in Colorado Springs. The small estate affidavit required a sworn notary to verify the affiant. My mother had not walked into a legitimate banking institution or a law office to forge my grandfather's signature. She had utilized a low-wage clerk at a generic mailing center, a clerk who either failed to check identification or was deliberately paid to look the other way while a dead man's name was signed onto a legal form. My mother had an accomplice, a weak link in the chain of her felony. I folded the indemnification agreement and placed it securely into my laptop bag. The digital trail provided the motive. The confrontation in my kitchen provided the intent to defraud. Now I needed the ultimate physical weapon, the original undeniable document proving the trust existed before my mother destroyed it. I grabbed my car keys. I bypassed my desk. The confrontation was escalating rapidly. My mother knew I was aware of the theft. The element of surprise was gone. She would immediately call Jason. She would scramble to cover her tracks. The window of opportunity to secure the archives was closing. I locked my condo and headed for the elevator. The drive to the El Paso County Courthouse would take exactly 62 minutes. I needed to move fast before the Golden Sun decided to intervene. I merged onto Interstate 25, heading south toward Colorado Springs for the second time in 6 months. I had requested a half-day of personal time from my firm. My supervisors did not ask questions because actuaries do not take spontaneous leave without a precise, quantifiable reason. The traffic flowing along the highway was dense, but moving at a steady pace. I set the cruise control and allowed my mind to map the legal architecture of my mother's fraud. She had forged a sworn affidavit. She had utilized a generic strip mall notary to bypass the bank's authentication protocols. But all of those actions were secondary steps. They were the mechanisms of the theft. I needed to uncover the original structure she had dismantled. The El Paso County Courthouse is a heavy concrete building that prioritizes bureaucratic function over aesthetics. I parked my sedan in the adjacent municipal structure and walked through the mandatory metal detectors at the front entrance. The air inside the records department felt distinctly stagnant. It smelled of industrial floor wax dry toner ink and decades of decaying paper. Government buildings possess a specific, undeniable gravity. They hold the tangible ledgers of human existence: births, marriages, civil judgments, and deaths are all reduced to stamped ink stored in windowless rooms. I approached the main counter. A clerk with tired eyes and a blue lanyard resting over a beige sweater asked for my request slip. I handed her the index numbers associated with my grandfather's estate. She typed the digits into a terminal that looked older than I was. She frowned, clicking her mouse several times before turning back to me. "The recent probate filings are digitized," she explained, pointing a manicured finger at her glowing monitor. "But you requested the Historical Trust Index. Those specific files are archived on microfilm. You will have to pull them manually from the basement repository." I thanked her and descended the concrete staircase. The repository was silent, save for the low mechanical hum of the microfiche readers lined up along the back wall. The lighting was dim, designed to preserve the fragile historical records. I located the steel drawer corresponding to the year 2014, the year my grandfather was diagnosed with the early stages of his illness, the year he looked me in the eye and promised that my foundation was secure. For 3 hours, I sat in a hard plastic chair advancing spools of translucent film through the glowing lens of the machine. The screen flickered, projecting ghostly white text against a stark black background. I scanned property deeds, municipal tax liens, and generic civil disputes. My eyes burned from the harsh contrast, but I did not stop turning the heavy plastic dial. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the reel locked into position. The document I needed illuminated the glass plate. I printed a physical copy, paid the statutory certification fee to the archivist upstairs, and carried the heavy, embossed paper out to my car. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, adjusting the air conditioning vents to cool the enclosed cabin. I placed the document on the steering wheel and read the text line by line. It was not a standard last will and testament. It was an irrevocable trust. In the realm of American estate law, the word irrevocable carries absolute, unyielding weight. A standard revocable trust can be altered, amended, or dissolved by the grantor at any time before their passing. An irrevocable trust cannot. Once the ink dries and the notary seals the page, the assets are legally walled off from the world. They cease to belong to the individual who funded the account. The $350,000 was never part of my grandfather's general estate. It bypassed the standard probate process entirely. Upon his death, I became the sole beneficiary and the sole owner of those funds automatically. My mother, acting as the executor of his remaining trivial assets, had faced an impenetrable legal barrier. She could not access the UTMA money through standard inheritance laws because the money did not belong to the deceased. So, she manufactured a ghost. She drafted a fraudulent dissolution of the trust. She used the lazy junior notary from the retail shipping franchise to stamp a forged signature onto the termination clause. By falsely dissolving the irrevocable trust, she dumped the protected assets back into my grandfather's general checking balance. From there, she utilized the fake small estate affidavit to drain the account and wire the stolen capital directly to Grace Fellowship. She orchestrated this elaborate sequence for two distinct mathematical reasons. First, to deprive me of my autonomy and force my compliance. Second, to secure a significant charitable tax deduction for herself. By donating the stolen funds under her own name, she offset her household income tax liability, saving herself tens of thousands of dollars, while simultaneously funding her son's fake church salary. It was a brilliant sequence. It was thorough. It was a federal crime involving wire fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Jason. "Hey sis, been a while. I am grabbing a beer downtown tonight. Let us catch up. First round is on me." I stared at the glowing text. The timing was exquisite. The golden child never reached out unless he required a financial subsidy or a social favor. He had spent the last 3 years entirely ignoring my existence. Now, mere hours after I expelled our panicked mother from my kitchen, he was suddenly eager to buy me a drink. My mother had fled my condo and immediately dialed his number from her car. She warned him that the self-sufficient scapegoat was reviewing the ledgers. She told him the foundation was cracking. Jason was stepping in to perform damage control. He was the charming, charismatic offset to her rigid authority. He intended to smooth things over, to ply me with a craft beer and fraternal affection until I agreed to drop my inquiry and sign the waiver. He was doing her dirty work. He was the designated closer assigned to secure the signature my mother failed to extract. He believed I was still the quiet, accommodating sister who would absorb a loss to maintain the fragile family peace. He thought a familiar smile and a $14 beverage could erase a six-figure felony. He assumed he was luring me into a carefully managed environment where he held the social advantage. I unlocked my phone keyboard and typed a response. Sounds good. Name the place. I placed the certified copy of the irrevocable trust into my leather portfolio, resting it on the passenger seat. I started the ignition. The engine roared to life, vibrating steadily through the steering column. Jason believed he was laying a snare to neutralize a threat to his unearned lifestyle. He thought he was playing a game of emotional leverage. But actuaries do not play games. We calculate outcomes. I merged back onto the highway heading north toward Denver. The late afternoon shadows stretched long and thin across the asphalt. I was walking willingly into his trap. But I was bringing my own. The location Jason chose was a sprawling sports bar in the lower downtown district. It was an establishment designed to overwhelm the senses. Neon signs hummed against exposed brick walls. Dozens of flat-screen televisions broadcasted overlapping athletic events. The air hung thick, carrying the unmistakable scent of stale hops, spilled draft beer, and industrial fryer grease. It was loud, chaotic, and entirely disjointed. It was the perfect habitat for my brother. I arrived 10 minutes prior to our agreed time. I bypassed the crowded hostess stand and secured a small, high-top table near the back corner. The wooden surface was tacky to the touch, coated in a permanent layer of invisible residue. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my leather portfolio tucked safely between my feet. I did not order a drink. I sat in the dim lighting and waited for the golden sun to make his entrance. Jason walked through the front doors right on time. He moved with a practiced, loose-limbed swagger. He wore an expensive fitted Henley shirt and crisp denim, scanning the crowded room with a broad, practiced smile. When he spotted me sitting in the corner, his smile widened, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating. He was evaluating the target before stepping into the arena. He navigated through the maze of high tops and pulled out the metal stool across from me. He let out an exaggerated sigh, rubbing his hands together as if brushing off a long day of strenuous labor. "Bonnie, it is really good to see you," he said, projecting his voice over the din of the surrounding crowd. "You look great. City life suits you." I did not offer a reciprocal compliment. I did not smile. I simply looked at him, allowing the ambient noise of the bar to fill the space between us. He shifted his weight, adjusting his posture on the uncomfortable stool. He was unaccustomed to prolonged silence. He expected the traditional back and forth of generic family banter to grease the wheels of his impending request. When I refused to provide the social lubricant, he was forced to pivot directly to his rehearsed emotional leverage. "Listen, I know things have been tense." He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial octave. "Mom called me today. She was pretty upset about your conversation this afternoon. She said you two had a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. I repeated the word, testing its weight. "Is that what she called it?" Jason waved a hand, brushing the severity aside. "You know how she gets. She means well. But honestly, Bonnie, I am worried about Dad. He is not doing well. His heart condition is acting up again. The stress of this estrangement is taking a physical toll on him. He just wants this church project finished so he can rest. We all just want peace." My father did not have a failing heart. He had a mild, unthreatening murmur diagnosed a decade ago, which he managed with a daily pill and a rigid golf schedule. Jason was utilizing an invisible medical threat to manufacture guilt. He was deploying the exact same psychological tactic my mother had used with the baked pasta. He was attempting to make me responsible for the physical survival of the men who had stolen my future. A waitress appeared beside our table holding a black digital tablet. She asked if we were ready to order. "I will take an artisan pale ale," Jason said, flashing her a charming grin. "Whatever your most premium local draft is, put it in a tall glass." The waitress nodded and asked if he wanted to open a tab. Jason reached into his back pocket and extracted a slim leather wallet. He pulled out a piece of plastic and handed it to her. I watched the card move from his hand to hers. It was a sleek, matte black corporate credit card. The ambient neon light caught the silver embossed lettering across the front. The logo read, Agape Consulting. He was paying for a $14 craft beer using the business account funded by my grandfather's stolen estate. He was literally attempting to buy my compliance using my own money. The sheer brazenness of the act solidified my resolve into something cold and unbreakable. The waitress walked away toward the bar. Jason turned his attention back to me. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a familiar manila envelope. He laid it flat on the sticky wooden surface. "Look, Bonnie," he said, tapping the paper, "I am not here to argue about the past. I just want to help smooth things out. Mom left this with you earlier and you forgot to sign it. It is just a routine consent form for the donor plaque. Just a quick signature and all this tension goes away. Dad can stop stressing, Mom can stop worrying, we can go back to being a family." He slid the envelope across the table until the edge touched my folded hands. I ignored the paper. I looked up and met his gaze. I needed him to confess the structure of the scheme voluntarily. I needed to feed his arrogance until it eclipsed his caution. "I heard you got a new job, Jason," I said, shifting the topic entirely. The sudden pivot threw him off balance. His hand hovered awkwardly over the envelope. "What?" He blinked, processing the change in trajectory. "Oh, yeah, I did. Mom mentioned you were doing outreach work." I kept my tone mild, injecting a precise dose of feigned admiration. "It sounds impressive. You finally found a venture that stuck." Ego is a fatal flaw. When you praise an arrogant man, he will invariably hand you the rope to hang him. Jason's posture transformed instantly. The faux concern vanished, replaced by the preening pride of an unearned victory. "It is more than just outreach." He puffed out his chest, leaning back proudly. "I am the event director for the new youth wing. It is a massive undertaking. I handle all the community logistics, the vendor relationships, the strategic planning. The church needed someone with real corporate vision to run the operation." "That sounds lucrative." I offered a slight encouraging nod. "A position like that must come with a significant compensation package." He scoffed, waving his hand. The waitress returned, placing his tall, pale ale on the table and returning his matte black card. He slid the plastic back into his wallet. "It pays $85,000 a year," he boasted, taking a long, satisfying pull from his glass. "Plus bonuses. But I am an independent contractor. I set up my own LLC to handle the billing. Agape Consulting. It is highly tax efficient. The church pays the firm, and I manage the capital. It is a brilliant setup, honestly." The loop officially closed. He had just verbally confirmed every single data point on my spreadsheet. My parents donated the irrevocable trust bypassing the probate court through forgery. They claimed a massive charitable tax deduction, saving themselves thousands in federal liabilities. Grace Fellowship absorbed the stolen cash to prevent an audit, and the church turned around and hired Jason, paying him a lucrative, untraceable salary using the exact funds my grandfather intended for my survival. Jason set his beer down and wiped foam from his upper lip. "So," he pointed at the envelope, "if you just sign this, we can celebrate. I can even help you out if things are tight with your firm. You know, send some consulting work your way." He was offering me a crumb of my own inheritance. I stood up from the high-top stool. I reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and dropped it onto the sticky table next to his glass. "What are you doing?" he asked, his smug expression faltering. "I am paying for your drink, Jason," I said, picking up the manila envelope and sliding it smoothly into my leather portfolio. "Because apparently you are spending money that does not belong to you." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back and walked toward the exit, navigating the crowded floor with deliberate, measured steps. I heard him call my name over the blaring televisions, but I did not stop. The humid evening air hit my face as I stepped out onto the downtown sidewalk. I had the motive. I had the method. I had the physical paper trail proving the forgery. And I had the confession of the primary beneficiary. The actuarial audit was complete. The risk profile was finalized. I walked to my sedan and unlocked the door. Digital evidence and county records were potent tools, but I was an actuary, not a litigator. I knew how to identify a collapsed structure, but I did not know how to prosecute the architects who tore it down. If I brought this to the local police, it would get buried in bureaucratic delays. If I went to the church board, they would bury it to protect their tax status. I needed someone who understood the brutal mechanics of federal court. I needed someone who punished thieves for a living. I needed a shark. I started the engine, putting the car into gear. Tomorrow morning, I was going to buy a war. The directory in the lobby of the Cherry Creek high-rise listed Thorne & Associates on the top floor. I rode the elevator in silence, watching the floor indicator numbers climb higher. The environment shifted as the doors opened. The hallway featured thick carpets designed to absorb the sound of footsteps and frosted glass panels that obscured the view into the private suites. I was walking into the domain of Elias Thorne. He possessed a specific reputation within the Colorado legal community. He was a litigator who specialized in tearing apart fraudulent estates and dismantling corrupt trustees. He did not negotiate quiet apologies. He sought ruin. His office smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. He sat behind a sprawling walnut desk wearing a tailored charcoal suit. He did not offer a warm smile or a platitude regarding the unfortunate nature of family disputes. He merely gestured toward the heavy leather chair opposite his workspace. I sat down and placed my portfolio on my lap. I did not engage in small talk. I opened the leather flap and extracted the stack of documents I had compiled. I laid them out across the polished wood in a deliberate chronological sequence. I placed the certified irrevocable trust down first, the true foundation. Next, I set down the forged small estate affidavit, the lie. Then I placed the wire transfer routing receipt provided by Pastor David, the theft. Following that, I arranged the Agape Consulting registration records and the publicly available church tax filings, the laundering mechanism. Finally, I placed the unsigned indemnification agreement my mother had brought to my condo, the attempted cover-up. I sat back and rested my hands on the armrests of the chair. Elias did not ask for a verbal summary. He picked up a pair of reading glasses from his desk, slid them onto his face, and began to read. For 12 minutes, the only sound in the office was the crisp turning of heavy paper. I watched his eyes scan the spreadsheets I had built. He cross-referenced the dates on the trust with the dates on the forged affidavit. He examined the perfectly smooth signature of a man dying from an aggressive neurological tremor. He studied the registered agent address for the shell company. He removed his glasses and folded the temples. He looked at me with a sharp, evaluating gaze. "You compiled this audit yourself," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes," I answered. "I am a commercial actuary. I calculate risk and structural failures." Elias nodded, tapping his index finger against the forged affidavit. "Your parents are facing a catastrophic legal exposure, Bonnie. The sequence they executed touches multiple federal statutes." He picked up the documents one by one, translating my data into his legal framework. Bypassing a probate court using a forged signature constitutes felony identity theft and fraud. Transferring those protected assets across banking lines initiates federal wire fraud. Claiming the stolen capital as a charitable deduction introduces the Internal Revenue Service and tax evasion penalties. Then he picked up the unsigned indemnification agreement. This specific paper elevates the situation. He explained, his voice taking on a hard, precise edge. "Your mother delivered this to your residence after the funds were frozen. She attempted to coerce you into relinquishing your rights under false pretenses. That transforms a financial theft into witness tampering. It proves premeditation and a deliberate effort to obstruct an ongoing financial review. He set the paper down and leaned back in his chair. I can dismantle them, he said, but my services require a substantial commitment. I require a $15,000 retainer to initiate the filings. He named a price that would bankrupt most individuals my age. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to ask for a payment plan or a contingency agreement. I opened my purse and retrieved my checkbook. I unspooled a blue pen. My parents had stolen my primary safety net. They believed their theft would leave me vulnerable and dependent. But I had spent the last decade building a secondary net. I built it by denying myself comforts. I ate generic rice instead of dining out. I wore thrifted coats through brutal winters. I drove a reliable sedan and lived in a minimalist space. I saved every surplus dollar because I knew my family would never catch me if I fell. I wrote the check for $15,000. My hand did not shake. The ink flowed in a steady, confident line. I tore the slip from the booklet and slid it across the walnut desk. Elias picked up the check, inspecting the numbers. A faint shadow of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. He placed the payment into a desk drawer. I will have my paralegals draft the initial subpoenas today. He outlined his strategy. We will serve the bank, the church board, and your parents simultaneously. We will utilize armed process servers to deliver the notices. The shock value will prevent them from coordinating a unified defense. We will schedule separate depositions and force them to perjure themselves under oath. I held up my hand, stopping his momentum. No, I said quietly. Elias narrowed his eyes. You are paying me to execute a war, Bonnie. Subpoenas are the opening salvo. I do not want a protracted war, Elias. A legal siege gives them time. It gives my father time to hire his own counsel. It gives my mother time to invent a new spiritual justification. It gives Jason time to hide the remaining cash. I do not want them receiving letters in the mail. What is your alternative? He asked, leaning forward. I want them cornered, I replied. I want them isolated in a single space, without warning, and without an audience to manipulate. I want to present the ledger to their faces and watch the foundation crack in real time. We will not send process servers. We will trap them. Elias studied me. He recognized the cold efficiency of the calculation. A synchronized ambush required less billable hours, but promised a far more devastating psychological yield. He nodded slowly, tapping his pen against the desk. We will do it your way. He agreed. Let me finalize the federal complaint draft so we have the loaded weapon ready to fire. You find the venue to spring the trap. I stood up, gathered my empty portfolio, and shook his hand. The leather handle of my bag felt heavy, carrying the invisible weight of the impending destruction. I rode the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the bright Denver afternoon. The sun reflected off the glass facades of the surrounding buildings. I walked toward my parked sedan, pulling my phone from my pocket to check for any missed calls. An automated notification bypassed my spam filter. Grace Fellowship maintains a digital mailing list for former congregation members and local residents. I had never bothered to unsubscribe. I opened the unread message. The email header featured a glossy, high-resolution architectural rendering of the newly constructed youth facility. The text below the image was printed in elegant gold typography. Grace Fellowship requests the honor of your presence at our exclusive VIP gala this Saturday evening. Black tie optional. I read the subsequent paragraph. The text announced a special dedication ceremony highlighting the profound generosity of the project sponsors. It explicitly named the Edwards family as the primary benefactors funding the expansion. I stared at the glowing screen. My parents were hosting a lavish celebration using my stolen inheritance. They were wearing expensive clothes, eating catered food, and receiving the adoring applause of hundreds of congregants. They were basking in the glory of a religious vanity project purchased with my grandfather's trust fund. I was not on the guest list. I had not received a formal invitation. The prodigal daughter was excluded from the party paid for by her own financial execution. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. They thought they could finalize the theft under the cover of a holy celebration. They believed the bright lights and the loud music would drown out the quiet ticking of the ledger. I opened my car door. I did not have an invitation to the VIP gala, but I was going to buy a seat in the front row. Friday arrived blank and quiet. It was the designated buffer separating the strategic planning from the tactical execution. I spent the morning within the austere confines of my apartment, engaging in a methodical routine designed to suppress any lingering emotional turbulence. I am an actuary. My profession relies on the absolute elimination of panic. I control the variables I can influence and prepare for the deviations I cannot predict. The primary variable under my control was my presentation. I bypassed the standard business casual attire I wore to the firm. I selected a charcoal gray suit. The fabric was a dense, unyielding wool blend. The cut was sharp, precise, and devoid of any softening accents. It was a suit designed for a courtroom, not a church gala. I laid the garments flat across my ironing board, pressing the steam iron against the lapels until the creases were rigid enough to draw blood. I was preparing an armor. While the steam hissed against the fabric, my internal monologue engaged in a brief, brutal struggle. Growing up in the Edwards household meant absorbing a specific psychological conditioning. Peace was the highest virtue, and peace always required sacrifice. It was an unspoken but rigidly enforced mandate. If Jason accumulated debt, the family peace dictated that my parents pay it off. If my father raised his voice, the family peace dictated that my mother apologize for provoking him. If I achieved something independently, the family peace dictated that I minimize my success to prevent Jason from feeling inadequate. I was taught that standing up for myself was inherently selfish. I was conditioned to believe that holding my family accountable was an act of aggression. For a fractured minute, standing in the quiet of my bedroom holding a hot iron, the ghost of that conditioning whispered in my ear. It told me to drop the litigation. It suggested that a public confrontation would cause irreparable damage. It argued that surrendering the $350,000 was a reasonable price to pay to avoid the crushing guilt of destroying my own blood. I set the iron down. The hiss of the steam faded. I walked to my bedside table and opened the top drawer. I reached past a stack of charging cables and retrieved a small velvet pouch. I unfastened the drawstring and pulled out a heavy circular object. It was my grandfather's silver pocket watch. He carried it every day for 40 years. It was an antique mechanical timepiece featuring a complex internal gear system. It did not require a battery. It required daily maintenance. It demanded to be wound. He gave it to me on the day I graduated from college, placing it in my hand and telling me that time was the only currency a person could never earn back. I held the cold silver casing in my palm. I gripped the small ridged dial at the top and turned it clockwise. Click, click, click. The gears engaged, tightening the internal spring. The mechanism caught, storing the kinetic energy. I held the watch to my ear. A sharp, rhythmic ticking resonated through the metal casing. It was a steady, unrelenting cadence. The sound cut through the silence of my apartment, slicing away the lingering whispers of my childhood conditioning. The ticking was mathematics made audible. It was proof of motion. It was the sound of a ledger balancing. My parents had attempted to steal my future, but they could not silence the clock. They had used my grandfather's legacy to fund their vanity, but the watch remained in my possession. I slipped the silver timepiece into the breast pocket of the charcoal blazer. I felt the comforting weight resting against my ribs. My phone chimed from the kitchen counter, a harsh notification sound disrupting my focus. I walked out to the living area and picked up the device. The screen displayed a relentless cascade of text messages originating from my mother's number. The failed ambush in my kitchen and my subsequent radio silence had driven her into a state of frantic escalation. Bonnie, you need to call your father immediately. This silent treatment is childish. The messages transitioned quickly from annoyance to emotional manipulation. We are terrified for your spiritual well-being. You are choosing money over your own flesh and blood. Please let us help you find your way back. When the guilt failed to elicit a response, she pivoted to the ultimate weapon in her arsenal, the spiritual threat. God sees your hardened heart, Bonnie. He knows the truth of our intentions. Vengeance belongs to the Lord, not to an ungrateful daughter. Do not mistake our patience for weakness. You are playing a dangerous game. I read the text block twice. The audacity was breathtaking. She had forged a federal document, stolen a 6-figure trust fund, and laundered the proceeds through a religious institution. Yet she stood in her immaculate suburban kitchen, typing out threats of divine retribution, assigning the moral high ground to herself. She genuinely believed her own narrative. I did not type a reply. I did not engage in the emotional crossfire. I highlighted the entire text thread, exported the conversation, and forwarded the digital file directly to Elias Thorne. Elias responded 3 minutes later. His message contained a single PDF attachment and a brief note. The harassment file is updated. The demand packet is finalized. The gun is loaded, Bonnie. Pull the trigger when you are ready. I opened the attachment. It was a 40-page draft of a federal civil complaint. The header listed the United States District Court for the District of Colorado. The plaintiff's name was Bonnie Edwards. The defendants were listed in stark, bold typography: Richard Edwards, Carol Edwards, Jason Edwards, and Grace Fellowship Incorporated. The document detailed the timeline of the fraud, the exact statutes violated, and the demand for immediate restitution plus punitive damages. It was a masterpiece of legal destruction. It was the physical manifestation of the ticking watch in my pocket. Saturday evening descended over the Front Range, bringing a sharp drop in temperature. I drove my sedan south along the interstate, the headlights of oncoming traffic blurring into a continuous ribbon of white light. I exited the highway and navigated the winding suburban roads leading toward the sprawling campus of Grace Fellowship. The church occupied a massive plot of prime real estate. The architecture was modern, featuring sharp angles and expansive walls of tinted glass. The parking lot was packed with luxury vehicles. Valet attendants in red vests directed traffic through a designated drop-off zone. I bypassed the valet, parking my sedan in a dark overflow lot near the edge of the property. I turned off the engine, but left the keys in the ignition. I sat in the cold cabin, staring through the windshield. 200 yards away, the new youth wing stood illuminated against the night sky. The glass facade glowed with warm, ambient light. I could see the silhouettes of hundreds of people moving through the atrium. They were holding champagne flutes and wearing expensive evening attire. They were laughing and talking, exchanging pleasantries over plates of catered hors d'oeuvres. They were celebrating the successful completion of a holy endeavor. They were honoring my parents for their profound, selfless generosity. The tension inside my car stretched taut. It felt like a physical pressure pressing against my chest. This was the precipice. Every action I had taken over the past 4 days, the spreadsheet audits, the tense meeting with Pastor David, the confrontation over the lasagna, the solitary hours in the county archives, the retention of a ruthless litigator, all of it converged on this single point in time. If I put the car in reverse and drove back to Denver, I could keep the peace. I could let them have the money. I could let Jason play his role as the visionary outreach director. I could maintain the quiet, sterile safety of my self-sufficient exile. I reached inside my blazer pocket. My fingers brushed the cool silver casing of the pocket watch. The faint, rhythmic ticking vibrated against my fingertips. I withdrew my hand. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the cold asphalt. The crisp evening air filled my lungs. I closed the door, shutting out the silence of the vehicle. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase, securing the 40-page federal draft, the certified trust, the forged affidavit, and the tax filings. I began walking across the dark parking lot, moving deliberately toward the glowing, stained glass. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, setting a steady tempo. The prodigal daughter was not coming home to beg for forgiveness. She was coming to collect the debt. The glass doors of the new youth facility parted with a quiet, mechanical hiss. The climate inside was regulated to a perfect ambient temperature, offering a stark contrast to the cold Colorado evening. The space smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted tenderloin. A string quartet occupied a raised corner platform, playing a classical arrangement that floated above the hum of affluent conversation. Women in floor-length silk gowns and men in tailored evening wear milled around cocktail tables draped in pristine white linen. In the center of the expansive atrium, an intricate ice sculpture, shaped like a descending dove, slowly wept frozen water into a silver basin. It was a staggering display of wealth, dressed up as spiritual devotion. I remained near the entrance, standing beside the coat check counter. My charcoal gray business suit set me apart from the festive congregants. I held my leather briefcase in my right hand. Inside the dark interior compartment rested the certified irrevocable trust, the forged legal affidavit, the financial ledger spreadsheets, and the 40-page federal civil complaint drafted by Elias Thorne. The physical weight of the paper anchored me to the floor. I was carrying the exact instrument of their impending ruin into the very center of their coronation. At the far end of the banquet hall, a polished acrylic podium commanded the attention of the room. The music faded into silence. A collective hush settled over the crowd as a theatrical spotlight illuminated the stage. My mother and father stood behind the microphone. Jason flanked them a few steps back, projecting an aura of humble reverence. He wore a crisp navy suit and clasped his hands near his waist, playing the part of the visionary outreach director. My mother leaned forward. Her voice trembled, carrying a manufactured vulnerability that echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. She wiped a single tear from her cheek with a manicured finger. Building this sanctuary required a profound leap of faith, she told the captive audience. It required us to look past our own worldly comforts and surrender our resources to a higher purpose. When Richard and I inherited my father's estate, we knew the funds did not belong to us. They belonged to the future. They belonged to the youth of this community. The crowd murmured in collective awe. A woman standing 2 feet away from me dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The dramatic irony saturated the room thick enough to choke on. My parents were receiving a standing ovation for surrendering resources they had stolen from their own daughter through felony wire fraud. They were spinning a narrative of holy sacrifice while utilizing a monumental charitable tax deduction to shield their household income. They were acting like religious martyrs while laundering a 6-figure payout to their unemployed son. I watched my father place a supportive hand on my mother's shoulder. The optics were flawless. The underlying foundation was a lie. Someone stepped into my peripheral vision. I turned my head slightly. It was Aunt Susan, my father's older sister. She wore a sequined dress that caught the overhead lighting and held a crystal flute of sparkling cider. Susan operated as the unofficial gossip conduit for the extended family tree. She thrived on social currency and utilized passive aggression as her primary method of communication. Growing up, she was the relative who always offered unsolicited advice regarding my thrifted wardrobe, hinting that my lack of presentation reflected a lack of grace. She stopped a few inches from me. Her eyes scanned my gray wool suit, noting the deliberate lack of celebratory flair. She leaned in close. Her perfume smelled heavily of lavender and gin. "Bonnie," she whispered, pitching her voice to convey an artificial layer of sympathy. "I am so surprised to see you here tonight. Considering the circumstances, it is rather brave of you to show your face." She took a tiny sip of her cider. "Your parents have been so worried about your spiritual state. Coming to their celebration must be difficult for your pride." I looked at Susan. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight or clutch my briefcase tighter. I offered a pleasant, accommodating smile, the kind of generic smile an actuary gives a client when denying an insurance claim. "It is not difficult at all, Susan," I replied, keeping my tone bright and conversational. "I paid for this building. I would not miss the grand opening." Her smile faltered. The crystal flute in her hand tilted, spilling a single drop of cider onto the polished floor. She processed the words, trying to decipher the angle of the supposed joke. She found no humor in my unblinking expression. I stepped around her, leaving her frozen near the coat check, trying to parse the mathematics of a puzzle she did not know existed. The applause erupted again, drowning out the final notes of my mother's tearful speech. My parents waved to the congregation descending the short staircase at the side of the platform. Pastor David stood near the bottom step, waiting to shake their hands. He wore a dark suit and a silver tie. He beamed for the hired photographer, capturing the monumental moment for the church newsletter. I moved through the crowd, navigating the sea of tuxedos and gowns. I did not rush my pace. I walked with the measured, steady rhythm of an auditor inspecting a damaged site. As I breached the front row of tables, Pastor David turned his head. His eyes locked onto mine. The color drained from his face in an instant. The practiced pastoral smile vanished entirely. His jaw went slack. He recognized the gray suit from the bakery booth. He remembered the folded indemnification waiver left unsigned on a laminate table. He saw the leather briefcase swinging gently at my side. The photographer asked him to look back toward the camera lens, but David remained paralyzed, staring at the threat, walking directly into his sanctuary. I reached the edge of the stage perimeter. My parents and Jason were distracted, shaking hands with affluent donors a few yards away. They had not yet noticed my arrival. David stepped toward me, his hands raised slightly with his palms facing outward in a gesture of frantic appeasement. "Bonnie," he hissed under his breath, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "You cannot be here right now. This is a private event. The board members are present." I did not lower my voice to a whisper, but I kept it calm and precise. "I am not here to enjoy the catering, David. I am here to finalize the audit." I reached into my pocket and touched the cold silver of my grandfather's watch. "You have a private study in the administrative wing, the one with the soundproof walls." He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed above his tight collar. "Yes, but I cannot leave the gala. I am scheduled to deliver the closing blessing in 20 minutes. This is the most important night of the fiscal year." I tapped a leather surface of my briefcase. "You will gather my mother, my father, and Jason. You will escort them into your private study within the next 5 minutes. I do not care what excuse you invent to extract them from the floor." He shook his head, his breathing growing shallow. "I cannot do that. They are the guests of honor. It will cause a scene." I took one step closer, invading his personal space. I let the clinical detachment drop just enough to show him the edge of the blade. "Gather them now, Pastor, or I will walk up those stairs, take the microphone you just abandoned, and read the El Paso County probate records to this entire room. I will detail the exact routing numbers of your money laundering operation, while the photographer captures the reaction of your board members." He looked at the microphone. He looked at my briefcase. The terror in his eyes solidified into grim compliance. He nodded once, a jerky, defeated motion. He turned around and walked toward my parents to deliver the summons. The administrative wing of Grace Fellowship was completely empty. The congregation and the catering staff remained gathered in the atrium, leaving the long, carpeted hallway draped in thick, heavy silence. Pastor David's study was located at the far end of the corridor, behind a set of double oak doors. The space was designed to project ecclesiastical authority. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound theological volumes. Thick velvet curtains covered the windows, ensuring absolute privacy. It was an environment constructed for quiet confessions and discreet negotiations. I walked into the study and selected the high-backed leather chair positioned directly opposite the mahogany desk. I did not sit behind the desk. I did not need to borrow the pastor's artificial authority to command the room. I set my briefcase on the polished wooden surface, unfastened the brass latches, and withdrew my cell phone. I dialed Elias Thorne's direct line. He answered on the first ring. "Are we in position, Bonnie?" His voice was crisp, carrying a sharp metallic edge through the small speaker. I pressed the speakerphone icon and placed the device dead center on the mahogany desk. "We are in position, Elias. The subjects are arriving momentarily." "Excellent. Keep the line open. I have the federal drafts queued on my terminal." I folded my hands in my lap and waited. The ticking of my grandfather's pocket watch resonated softly from inside my blazer. 60 seconds passed. Then I heard the heavy, frantic footsteps approaching down the carpeted hallway. The oak doors swung inward, hitting the doorstops with a violent thud. My father entered first. His face was flushed, a dark mottled red, contrasting sharply against the stiff white collar of his tuxedo shirt. My mother followed close behind him, clutching the sides of her silk evening gown. Jason brought up the rear, checking the empty hallway over his shoulder before Pastor David slipped inside and quietly secured the heavy wooden doors. The click of the deadbolt locking us into the soundproof space felt like the closing of a vault. My father did not pause to assess the room. He advanced toward my chair, pointing a thick, rigid finger at my face. The engineered grace he displayed on the auditorium stage evaporated entirely, revealing the volatile, aggressive patriarch he was behind closed doors. "What is the meaning of this, Bonnie?" he shouted, his voice bouncing off the oak paneling. "You walk into the most important night of our lives and threaten the leadership of this church. You humiliate us in front of the entire congregation. Have you lost your mind? How dare you pull a stunt like this after everything we have done?" He expected me to shrink. He expected me to revert to the quiet, accommodating teenager who absorbed his rage to maintain the fragile family peace. He utilized volume and intimidation as his primary tools of control, relying on the assumption that conflict terrifies me. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. My mother stepped out from behind him. Her eyes darted toward the speakerphone resting on the desk, but her anger superseded her caution. She lunged forward, reaching out with her manicured hands, attempting to physically grab the sleeve of my blazer. It was an aggressive, invasive gesture designed to establish physical dominance and pull me up from the chair. "You selfish, ungrateful girl," she hissed, her voice trembling with raw venom. "We will not allow you to ruin this dedication. You are going to walk out the back exit right now and go home." I stood up, executing a swift lateral step backward. Her hands grasped empty air. The sudden movement threw her off balance, forcing her to catch herself against the edge of the mahogany desk. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. I utilized the precise clinical voice I employ when explaining an irreversible structural collapse to an adversarial client. The actuary's voice. It is devoid of emotion, devoid of hesitation, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Sit down," I commanded. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The absolute authority in the two syllables paralyzed them. My father froze his hand, still suspended in midair. My mother gripped the edge of the desk, her breath hitching in her chest. Jason, who had been hovering near the door, took a sudden, involuntary step backward, pressing his spine against the bookshelves. They had never heard this tone from me. They did not recognize the woman standing across the desk. Pastor David slunk toward the corner of the room, attempting to merge with the shadows. "Sit down," I repeated, pointing to the row of guest chairs facing the desk, "or I will unlock that door, walk back out to the atrium, and initiate a federal audit in front of your wealthy donors." My father slowly lowered his hand. The red flush drained from his cheeks, replaced by a cautious, wary pallor. He moved to the nearest chair and sank onto the cushion. My mother sat next to him, smoothing the silk of her dress with trembling hands. Jason remained standing near the door, refusing to move deeper into the room. I remained standing. I reached into the open compartment of my leather briefcase. It was time to lay the ledger bare. I pulled out the first document, the certified copy printed on heavy municipal paper. I placed it flat on the mahogany desk, pushing it toward my parents. "This is the irrevocable trust established by Arthur Edwards 10 years ago," I stated, reading the facts without inflection. The assets held within this trust bypassed the probate process entirely upon his death. The capital was legally walled off. It did not belong to the estate, and it certainly did not belong to the executor. My father stared at the document. He recognized the legal seal. He shifted his gaze toward my mother. "Carol, what is she talking about?" I reached back into the briefcase. I pulled out the second document, the false sworn statement. I set it down next to the trust, aligning the edges perfectly. "This is the small estate affidavit filed in El Paso County." I continued. "Box 3 swears under penalty of perjury that the deceased died intestate. The signature on the bottom line belongs to my grandfather." I leaned forward, placing my index finger directly on the dark, sweeping ink of the signature. My grandfather suffered from an aggressive neurological tremor for the final 24 months of his life. He could not hold a pen steady enough to sign a birthday card. Yet this signature is flawlessly smooth. It was forged. It was notarized by a junior clerk at a retail shipping franchise, avoiding standard banking authentication. My mother utilized this forged document to illegally dissolve an irrevocable trust and drain $350,000 from a protected account. My father's breathing grew shallow. He turned to my mother, his eyes wide with a sudden, crushing comprehension. "You told me the lawyer handled the transfer, Carol. You told me the funds were cleared." My mother pressed her lips into a thin, white line, refusing to answer him. She stared at the forged affidavit, recognizing the physical evidence of her felony resting on the pastor's desk. I retrieved the third stack of paper, the financial records I had extracted from the state database and the church tax filings. I dropped them onto the desk with a heavy, conclusive thud. "These are the incorporation papers for Agape Consulting," I said, shifting my gaze toward the golden sun cowering by the door. "A limited liability company registered to Jason Edwards. The accompanying documents are the quarterly vendor payout schedules for Grace Fellowship. They detail an $85,000 dispersal to Jason's shell company." I looked back at my parents. The architectural blueprint of their fraud was fully exposed. "You bypassed the probate court using forgery, committing felony identity theft. You wired the stolen assets to this church, committing federal wire fraud. You claimed the stolen capital as a charitable deduction, committing tax evasion. And the church laundered the exact funds back to your unemployed son, funding a phantom salary." The bluster completely evaporated from my father. The aggressive patriarch was gone, replaced by a man staring down the barrel of a catastrophic legal ruin. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "Bonnie, please," he whispered, his voice fracturing. "We can fix this. We can explain." I reached out and tapped the speakerphone resting in the center of the documents. The small green light glowed steadily, indicating the active connection. "I am not the person you need to explain this to, Dad," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "I would like to introduce you to Elias Thorne. He is a senior litigation partner based in Denver." The speaker crackled as Elias cleared his throat thousands of miles away. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Edwards," Elias said, his metallic voice filling the soundproof study. "I specialize in prosecuting federal wire fraud and illegal estate manipulation. I have a 40-page civil complaint currently queued on my terminal, ready for filing at the district courthouse on Monday morning." The trap was fully sprung. The foundation had cracked. The destruction was about to commence. The speakerphone rested on the polished mahogany surface anchoring the tension in the room. Elias Thorne did not raise his voice. He did not need to utilize volume to command attention. He possessed the quiet, lethal authority of a predator who had already secured the perimeter. He began to recite the specific architecture of their impending destruction, outlining the charges with cold, mechanical precision. Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343. Elias stated his enunciation crisp and formal. That is the federal statute for wire fraud. It carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison. By utilizing electronic networks to transfer funds obtained through a forged legal instrument, you have triggered federal jurisdiction. Furthermore, Title 26, Section 7201 covers the evasion of assessed taxes. Claiming those illicit funds as a charitable offset places you squarely in the crosshairs of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. My father slumped lower in his chair. The starch in his tuxedo collar seemed to wilt. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to block out the sterile recitation of his own ruin. Elias was not finished. He paused, allowing the weight of the previous statutes to settle before delivering the final fatal blow. However, the financial crimes are merely the baseline. He continued, the speaker crackling slightly. Mrs. Edwards visited my client's residence prior to this gathering. She presented a document intended to coerce my client into relinquishing her legal rights. Presenting a fraudulent indemnification waiver to silence a primary witness escalates this matter significantly. Under federal law, that constitutes witness tampering and obstruction of justice. It proves a deliberate, calculated conspiracy to conceal the initial theft. The silence inside the soundproof study grew suffocating. The air felt thin, depleted of oxygen. My mother began to hyperventilate. The rhythmic rise and fall of her chest accelerated into shallow, erratic gasps. Her hands gripped the fabric of her silk evening gown, twisting the expensive material into tight, wrinkled knots. The impenetrable facade of the righteous, devout matriarch fractured, shattering into 100 jagged pieces. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and unfocused, searching for a lifeline, an escape hatch, an ally. She turned her head toward the corner where Pastor David stood pressed against the bookshelves. "David," she pleaded, her voice a high-pitched, fractured wheeze. Tell this lawyer that our hearts were pure. We did not keep a single penny for ourselves. We gave this to the Lord. We built a sanctuary for the children. You know our intentions. You have to explain to them that this was a holy offering." She was attempting to deploy the ultimate religious shield. She believed that invoking divine purpose could somehow sanitize a felony. She expected her spiritual leader to step forward and wrap her crimes in theological justification. Pastor David slowly stepped out of the shadows. He looked at my mother, then shifted his gaze toward the forged affidavit resting on his desk. He was a man who managed a multi-million-dollar religious corporation. He understood optics. He understood risk. Faced with the choice between protecting a wealthy donor and protecting his tax-exempt empire, his calculation was instantaneous. He severed the alliance. "I cannot do that, Carol," he said, his tone devoid of any pastoral warmth. His voice was flat, carrying the hollow resonance of a corporate executive terminating an employee. My mother's mouth fell open. "David, we funded your project. We built this wing." "You lied to the board of directors," he countered, stepping further away from her, as if her proximity might transmit a disease. "You assured the financial committee that the estate transfer was legally cleared. You submitted fraudulent routing data to our accounting department. You compromised the integrity of this entire institution." He looked directly at my father, delivering the revelation that would seal their fate. "The Internal Revenue Service is not just reviewing the wire transfer," David confessed, his posture stiffening. "We received the official notification yesterday morning. The agency is initiating a comprehensive audit of our capital campaign. We are freezing all associated vendor accounts immediately. To protect the church, we must cooperate fully with the federal authorities. We are handing over your file." The betrayal was absolute. The holy sanctuary they had purchased with my inheritance was actively locking its doors against them. In the corner of the room near the heavy oak doors, a sharp, sudden movement broke the tableau. Jason pushed himself away from the bookshelves. His crisp navy suit, the costume of the visionary outreach director, suddenly looked like a prison uniform. The charming swagger he exhibited at the sports bar was gone, replaced by the frantic, primal terror of a cornered animal. He stared at our mother, his face contorted in panic. "You told me the capital was clear," he shouted, stepping toward her, pointing a shaking finger. "You told me the church approved the contract and the money was clean." "Jason, please." My mother reached a hand toward him, seeking the comfort of her favorite son. "We did this for you. We did this to protect your future." "Do not put this on me," he yelled, recoiling from her outstretched hand. He backed away, treating her touch like a live wire. I just signed the incorporation papers. You set up the routing numbers. You brought me the vendor contracts. If the feds audit Agape Consulting, they are going to see my name on the registered agent forms." His voice cracked, rising in pitch. "You used my name. You forged a document and funneled the cash through my company. You are going to get me arrested for money laundering." The golden child, the son who had received decades of unconditional financial subsidies and unearned praise, was turning on his benefactors in an instant. The illusion of their perfect, devoted family evaporated. Their toxic enmeshment was always transactional, based entirely on a flow of stolen resources. The moment the resources transformed into a liability, the loyalty dissolved into vicious self-preservation. I remained seated in the leather wingback chair. I did not lean forward. I did not smile. I did not offer a single word of interruption. I sat perfectly still, watching the structure collapse. As an actuary, I have studied the mechanics of a controlled demolition. When the core load-bearing pillars of a building are compromised, the exterior shell does not just fall. It implodes, pulling everything inward, crushing itself under its own accumulated weight. I was watching a psychological implosion. My father sat paralyzed in a state of catatonic shock. My mother wept, clutching her silk dress abandoned by her spiritual leader. My brother paced the floor, shouting accusations, terrified of a prison sentence he lacked the fortitude to survive. They were destroying each other. I reached into the breast pocket of my charcoal blazer. I withdrew my grandfather's silver pocket watch. The heavy metal casing felt cool and solid against my palm. I held it up, letting the ambient light of the study catch the polished surface. I tapped my index finger against the glass dial. Click. The sharp metallic sound cut through Jason's frantic shouting and my mother's weeping. It was a small noise, but it carried the weight of a gavel striking wood. The room went silent. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Elias. I spoke, addressing the speakerphone. "Please dictate the terms of the settlement." The lawyer cleared his throat. "My client is offering a singular, narrow window to resolve this matter outside of the federal court system," he stated. "You will return the principal sum of $350,000. In addition, you will cover the punitive legal retainer fee of $15,000. I set the silver watch down on the mahogany desk, right next to the forged affidavit. "You have 48 hours to wire $365,000 into my attorney's escrow account," I said, delivering the ultimatum with cold, unyielding finality. "If the ledger is balanced by Monday evening, Elias will shred the federal complaint. We will walk away and leave you to deal with the inevitable tax penalties on your own. If the funds do not clear the escrow account by 5 o'clock on Monday, we file the lawsuit and hand the discovery packets to the district attorney." My father stared at the watch. His chest hitched. "Bonnie," he croaked, his voice a ruined whisper, "you know we do not have that kind of liquidity. We claimed the tax deduction, but the physical cash is sitting in the church building fund. We cannot access it." I looked at him, studying the desperate, hollow expression of a man who had finally run out of leverage. I stood up from the leather chair. I closed the latches on my briefcase, securing the remaining documents. "I know, Dad," I replied, picking up the silver watch and slipping it back into my pocket. "But where will you get the cash is not my variable to solve. You have 48 hours. My father stared at me. The reality of the 48-hour deadline settled over his shoulders, pressing him down into the leather chair. For my entire life, he had been the sole architect of our family dynamics, dictating terms and controlling the flow of resources. He had never found himself sitting on the wrong side of an ultimatum. He unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket. His hands were shaking. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to adopt a posture of earnest negotiation. "Bonnie, please." He lowered his tone, attempting to strip away the hostility and replace it with paternal reason. "You are a smart girl. You understand financial logistics. We cannot produce that kind of capital over a weekend. The banks are closed. Our assets are tied up in real estate and retirement portfolios. We can establish a payment plan. I will sign a promissory note. I will pay you a monthly premium with interest." I looked down at him. A promissory note from a man who had just forged a legal document held zero actuarial value. I do not extend credit to thieves, Dad. He exhaled a ragged breath, running a hand over his face. "You know, we do not have the liquid cash, Bonnie," he repeated, his voice cracking. "We took the charitable deduction on our federal return, but the physical currency is sitting in the Grace Fellowship Building Fund. We gave it to them. We cannot withdraw it. The church holds the principal." Pastor David stepped out from the shadows near the bookshelves. He stood taller, adjusting the knot of his silver tie. He had remained quiet during Elias Thorne's recitation of the federal statutes, calculating the exact trajectory required to preserve his own institution. Now he possessed the opportunity to execute a flawless surgical separation. "The church does not hold the principal, Richard," the pastor stated. His voice was smooth, carrying the polished resonance he utilized during televised sermons. My father turned his head, confusion etching deep lines across his forehead. "What do you mean? You accepted the wire transfer 6 months ago." "We accepted a donation under the assumption of legal propriety," David corrected him. However, following the initiation of the banking freeze, our corporate council convened an emergency session this afternoon. To demonstrate total compliance with the ongoing federal inquiry, Grace Fellowship is voluntarily rejecting the illicit gift. We are authorizing our financial institution to reverse the transaction. The pastor looked at the speakerphone resting on the desk. "Mr. Thorne, the church will wire the original sum of $350,000 directly into your firm's escrow account on Monday morning. We are removing the stolen capital from our ledgers entirely." Elias responded immediately, his metallic voice slicing through the heavy air. "I will email the routing instructions to your legal department within the hour, David. Ensure the transaction is categorized as a restitution of stolen property." My father let out a sudden breath of profound relief. He leaned back against the chair, his posture loosening. The color returned to his cheeks. He looked at me, a faint echo of his former arrogance returning to his eyes. "There you go, Bonnie," he said, waving his hand toward the pastor. "The church is paying you back. The principal is returning to your trust. You are getting your inheritance. The ledger is balanced. You can drop this ridiculous lawsuit." I did not smile. I did not shift my stance. I allowed him to enjoy his manufactured relief for exactly 3 seconds. "The church returning my stolen property covers the principal, Dad." I clarified my tone, dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "You still owe Elias Thorne a $15,000 legal retainer. If that specific amount does not clear the escrow account by Monday evening, the federal complaint gets filed." My father scoffed a harsh, dismissive sound. $15,000 is a fraction of the total. We can secure a personal loan for that. I will write you a check on Monday. This entire nightmare is over." "You are mistaken, Richard," Pastor David interjected again. He stepped closer to the center of the room, delivering the poetic justice with the cold efficiency of an executioner. "The nightmare is not over. It is merely changing jurisdictions." My father frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You claimed a $350,000 charitable deduction on your joint income tax return," David explained. "You utilized a fraudulent donation to shield your household revenue from the federal government. By returning the stolen capital to your daughter, the church is officially voiding that donation receipt. We are required by law to file an amended return with the Internal Revenue Service, declaring the previous gift invalid." The blood drained from my father's face. The true scope of the structural collapse finally penetrated his arrogance. Under the American Tax Code, claiming a 6-figure deduction using forged documents triggers a civil fraud penalty. The IRS will demand the repayment of the evaded taxes. Furthermore, they will assess an additional penalty equating to 75% of the underpayment. Combined with the compounding interest, my parents were facing a sudden, catastrophic debt exceeding $150,000 owed directly to the federal government. They had stolen my foundation to buy a holy reputation. Now they were losing the money, the reputation, and their own financial solvency. But Pastor David was not finished. He needed to sever the final tie, protecting his empire from their contamination. Furthermore, the Board of Elders held a vote prior to this gala. David continued his voice, devoid of any pastoral mercy. Grace Fellowship cannot harbor individuals engaged in active federal financial crimes. It compromises our moral standing and our tax-exempt status. We are revoking your membership effective immediately. You are no longer welcome on this campus. You will not attend Sunday services. You will not participate in auxiliary groups. You are excommunicated. The final blow struck with devastating precision. They were losing their social kingdom. The sprawling campus, the respect of the congregation, the prestigious seating at the VIP galas, all of it vanished in a single sentence. They were no longer the holy benefactors of the youth wing. They were trespassing criminals. My mother let out a sharp, agonizing wail. She collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands. The silk evening gown rustled against the leather chair as she sobbed. Her tears were not born of repentance. They were born of profound, unyielding humiliation. The stage she had spent decades curating had just dropped her through the trapdoor. She lifted her head, her makeup smeared across her cheeks. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a desperate, frantic fury. She lunged upward, pushing herself out of the chair. She did not reach for my arm this time. She stood a few feet away, deploying the ultimate, final card in the arsenal of a toxic parent: the biological debt. I carried you for 9 months. She screamed, her voice tearing at the seams. I gave you life. I fed you and clothed you and put a roof over your head. You owe us your very existence. And you stand here plotting against your own flesh and blood? You are destroying this family over money. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest, attempting to transfer the crushing weight of her own guilt onto my shoulders. She expected the sheer volume of her maternal outrage to fracture my resolve. I looked at the woman who had forged her dying father's name to ensure my dependence. I did not raise my voice. I stripped away her delusion with surgical precision. I did not destroy this family over money, Mom, I said. She froze her mouth open, unable to process the calm, unwavering rejection of her narrative. You destroyed it over control. I continued my words, slicing through the heavy air of the soundproof study. You hated my independence so much you were willing to commit a felony just to see me fail. You gambled your entire life to punish my competence. And you lost. You just got caught. I reached across the mahogany desk and terminated the active call on my cell phone. The speaker emitted a sharp click, severing Elias Thorne from the room. I picked up the device and slid it into my pocket. I turned toward the heavy oak doors. Jason stood pressed against the bookshelves, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at me, his eyes wide, with the realization that the endless flow of unearned resources had permanently run dry. I did not offer him a single word. He was already a ghost. I reached for the brass handle and pulled the heavy door open. The muffled classical music from the atrium spilled into the silent study. I stepped across the threshold, walking out of the administrative wing and leaving them locked in the ruins of their own ego. 90 days constitute a standard fiscal quarter. In the corporate sector, it is the precise metric utilized to measure growth, structural stability, or rapid decline. On the 91st day following the gala, I sat at my home office desk and logged into my personal brokerage portal. The encrypted interface loaded, painting the screen with stark white numbers against a dark background. The sequence represented a profound restoration of balance: $350,000. The principal sum rested securely within a diversified high-yield index fund under my name. The capital was generating compounding interest, working to build the future my grandfather originally envisioned. Elias Thorne had executed his mandate flawlessly. True to Pastor David's terrified promise, the church wired the funds into the legal escrow account exactly 48 hours after the confrontation in the soundproof study. The $15,000 punitive retainer cleared the following morning directly from my parents' drained checking account. Elias took his fee, forwarded the inheritance to my portfolio, and sent a brief, single-line email confirming the closure of the audit. The ledger was balanced. But the ripple effects of a structural collapse do not stop when the primary debt is paid. A compromised foundation pulls the surrounding architecture down with it. The Internal Revenue Service operates entirely devoid of emotion. They do not care about spiritual intentions or tearful apologies delivered on a stage. They are the ultimate actuaries. Once Grace Fellowship filed the amended return invalidating the six-figure charitable deduction, the federal machinery engaged with terrifying efficiency. My parents received a notice of deficiency via certified mail. The document demanded the immediate repayment of the evaded income tax, plus a severe civil fraud penalty equating to 75% of the underpayment. Because they had depleted their liquid cash reserves to satisfy Elias Thorne's ultimatum, they could not produce the capital required by the federal government. When you fail to pay the IRS, they do not negotiate a gentle payment plan. They secure their interests. The El Paso County Recorder updated their public registry last Thursday. A federal tax lien now encumbers the sprawling suburban house where I grew up. The lien attaches a permanent legal claim to the property deed. My parents cannot sell the house, refinance their mortgage, or secure a simple line of credit until the government extracts its pound of flesh. Furthermore, county tax liens are matters of public record. They are published weekly in the local business journal. Aunt Susan reads the local business journal. She sent me a brief text message 2 weeks ago. The tone was remarkably subdued, stripped of her usual passive-aggressive condescension. She informed me that my parents had abruptly resigned their membership at the country club, citing a desire to live a more modest lifestyle. They stopped hosting Sunday dinners. They stopped attending the prominent social events in Colorado Springs. Their excommunication from the megachurch, combined with the public broadcast of their financial ruin, orchestrated a thorough, comprehensive social exile. The stage they spent decades curating had burned to the ground, leaving them to sweep up the ash in private. Grace Fellowship moved with equal swiftness to protect their own flanks. Agape Consulting lost its sole vendor contract before the weekend of the gala even concluded. The church board severed all ties with the shell company, erasing the fraudulent revenue stream overnight. Without the monthly influx of laundered cash, the LLC withered. Jason faced a sudden, unyielding reality. The golden child lacked marketable skills. He possessed a resume filled with bankrupt faith-based startups and a phantom employment gap measuring a decade. He could no longer rely on our parents to subsidize his expensive loft with the exposed brick walls. The well was permanently dry. He works at a large retail hardware franchise now. He does not hold a management position. He works on the loading dock. A mutual acquaintance from high school spotted him there last month. Jason wears an orange utility vest over a faded t-shirt. He spends 8 hours a day lifting 40-pound bags of topsoil concrete mix and industrial fertilizer into the back of pickup trucks. The man who sat in a sports bar sliding a matte black corporate card across a sticky table to buy a craft beer now punches a time clock and relies on hourly wages. The physical toll of the labor has stripped away his practiced swagger. He is learning the brutal, honest mathematics of surviving without a stolen safety net. I close the brokerage tab on my laptop. I walk out onto the balcony of my Denver condo. The morning air holds the crisp, biting edge of an approaching winter. The sky above the Rocky Mountains is a brilliant, unbroken blue. I lean against the metal railing, looking down at the city's streets waking up below. I hold a coffee mug in both hands, letting the ceramic warm my palms. It is crafted from heavy, artisan clay glazed in a deep ocean blue. It features a smooth, perfect rim and a solid, weighted base. It retains heat flawlessly. The cheap, chipped green mug from my college days is gone. I dropped it down the trash chute at the end of the hallway 2 weeks ago. I listened to it shatter against the metal interior, falling into the dark below. I no longer require a physical reminder of my survival, because survival is no longer my baseline. I am no longer clinging to the scraps of my past to justify my present. Society insists that severing ties with your bloodline is an inherent tragedy. Cultural narratives demand forgiveness regardless of the offense, pushing the idea that family is an unbreakable, sacred bond. There is a quiet, specific grief that accompanies a victory of this nature. It settles in your chest during the silent hours of the evening. You process the realization that winning a war against your family requires acknowledging you never truly had one. You merely shared a genetic sequence and a mailing address. You mourn the parents you deserved but never received. You mourn the brother who chose greed over kinship. You grieve the illusion. But grief does not equal regret. As an actuary, I look at the world through the lens of verifiable data. I understand the mechanics of risk and reward. When you maintain an association with individuals who view your competence as a threat and your assets as their personal treasury, you carry an immense, unpredictable risk. You live in a constant state of hypervigilance, anticipating the next betrayal. Math offers a cold, comforting clarity. Subtracting a severe liability always results in a net positive. Removing a toxic element from your structural foundation does not weaken the building. It reinforces it. It ensures that the walls will hold when the external storms arrive. I take a slow sip of the dark coffee. The warmth spreads through my chest, chasing away the chill of the morning air. I look out at the horizon, feeling a profound, weightless freedom. For 32 years, I walked on a fragile floor, constantly looking down, expecting the wood to splinter and give way beneath my feet. I waited for the inevitable betrayal. I waited for the other shoe to drop. I set the beautiful blue mug down on the glass balcony table. I am no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop, because I own the shoes. Let us examine the concept of the good daughter. Society has constructed a very specific, narrow mold for women born into dysfunctional environments. We are expected to act as the emotional shock absorbers for the people who raised us. If a parent is reckless, we are taught to be understanding. If a sibling is favored, we are instructed to be supportive. We are handed a script early in life dictating that maintaining the family peace is our primary moral responsibility. But peace is a deceptive word. In a toxic household, peace merely means compliance. It means you agree to absorb the damage so the perpetrators never have to look at the wreckage they create. For years, I wore the costume of the self-sufficient scapegoat. I convinced myself that needing nothing was a badge of honor. I thought walking away from the Sunday dinner table without shedding a tear was the ultimate victory. I believed my clinical detachment was an impenetrable shield. But silence is not a victory. Silence is a subsidy. When you refuse to call a theft by its true name, you are funding the thieves. You grant them the luxury of believing their own lies. My parents relied on my silence. They engineered a felony assuming my ingrained habit of keeping the peace would prevent me from verifying the math. Setting boundaries is rarely interpreted correctly by the people standing on the outside. When you finally draw a line in the sand, the architects of your misery will call you vindictive. They will label you petty. They will claim you are harboring grudges or seeking vengeance. But vengeance requires passion. Vengeance is messy and erratic, driven by the desire to inflict pain. What I executed inside that soundproof study was not vengeance. It was mathematics. An actuary understands that you cannot build a skyscraper on a sinkhole. You cannot establish a stable, secure life while someone else holds a hidden siphon connected directly to your foundation. Drawing a boundary is the equivalent of closing a compromised valve. It stops the leak. It forces the pressure back toward the source. I did not ruin my parents' lives. I merely presented the final invoice for the choices they made. They accrued a staggering debt of deceit and expected me to pay the interest. I handed the bill back to the rightful owners. I reach into the pocket of my coat. My fingers trace the engraved edges of the antique silver pocket watch. I pull it out and let it rest in the palm of my hand. The morning sun catches the polished metal, casting a bright reflection across the balcony. I hold the watch close to my ear. The internal gears move in perfect synchronized harmony. Click, click, click. It is a precise, unending rhythm. My grandfather carried this timepiece every single day. He understood the value of a solid foundation. He understood that time and truth are the only two variables no human being can permanently manipulate. My mother and father attempted to use his legacy as a weapon. They weaponized the money he saved to punish my independence. They thought they could starve me into submission by handing my safety net over to a religious institution. They wanted to buy holy applause. They wanted the congregation to look at them and see righteous, generous benefactors. They gave my inheritance away to spite me. But the universe possesses a flawless sense of irony. Their attempt to destroy my autonomy provided the exact mechanism that funded my unshakable freedom. They tried to purchase their own salvation, but the only thing they sacrificed was their own sanctuary. They traded their home, their reputation, and their favored son's comfort for a bronze plaque that will never be hung on a wall. There is a distinct, quiet strength that comes from surviving an audit of this magnitude. When you stop hoping the people who hurt you will suddenly wake up and realize their mistakes, you reclaim your own agency. You stop waiting for an apology that lacks any actual currency. You realize that closure does not come from a tearful reconciliation. Closure comes from securing your borders. It comes from knowing that no one will ever forge your signature or leverage your future again. I stand on the balcony and look out over the sprawling city of Denver. The streets below are filling with morning traffic. Thousands of people driving to work, carrying their own invisible ledgers. Some are carrying debts they do not owe. Some are paying interest on secrets that belong to their parents. I used to be one of them. I used to carry the heavy, suffocating weight of being the capable daughter who required no maintenance. I traded that weight for the clean, cold truth of a balanced spreadsheet. It is a trade I would make 100 times over. The silver watch continues to tick. The air is cold, but I do not shiver. My coat is thick, and my foundation is impenetrable. The architects of my former misery are currently learning how to live in the ruins they constructed. I do not wish them ill. I do not wish them anything at all. They are merely closed accounts, archived files in a database I will never need to access again. We are taught to fear the fallout of a severed family tie. We are warned about the loneliness of walking away. But the true tragedy is staying in a room where your worth is measured by how much you are willing to let them take. I learned that my worth is not negotiable. I learned that protecting my peace is not a sin. It is the most sacred duty I possess. This brings us to the final calculation. The numbers never lie. They only wait for someone brave enough to read them aloud. If you have ever been the scapegoat, forced to become the auditor of your own life, do not apologize for showing them the receipts. Drop a comment with the word balanced if you know what it feels like to finally close the ledger. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.